Right. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for tuning in. We deeply appreciate your participation this evening. I'm Dr. James Brumall, an associate professor of history at Shepherd University and the director of the George Heather Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. And, as director of the center, we try to interface with local and regional history that sort of transcends the Civil War era. And so tonight, I'm really excited by this program. And before turning it over to my colleague and friend, Ben Bankhurst, I must first acknowledge and thank West Virginia Humanities Council. We've been very fortunate. Oops, got some background feed there. We've been very fortunate in that, where's that coming from?
Oh, that might be Donna. Would you mind? There we go.
We've been very fortunate in that we received a CARES grant through West Virginia Humanities, which has allowed us to expand our programming in very key ways. And so, again, we acknowledge West Virginia Humanities for their help and support. So from here, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Ben Bankhurst, who is an assistant professor of history on the cusp of going up for tenure, which will go incredibly well. But for now, still an assistant professor of history. And Ben is a specialist in early America, but I think what will become very apparent tonight is how much he has interfaced with our local region, local partners, regional partners, as well as both graduate and undergraduate students at Shepherd University, which has in turn prompted some of the things we're going to be discussing tonight. And so with that, let me turn it over to Ben, and he in turn will introduce our panelists and the topic.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. As Jim had indicated, I'm a specialist in early America, and that's what really, upon moving to Shepherdstown in 2015, really attracted me to the legend of Wizard Clip. I had heard about the legend beforehand through an episode of, I believe, of Inside Appalachia about 10 years ago, covered an iteration of the legend. So one of the first stops I made upon establishing myself in the Lower Valley was to take a trip down to Middleway to see the sides of the legend. So what I would like to do now is introduce our panelists, and then I will start this evening off with a discussion of the context for the legend, and go into kind of paint a picture of what the Lower Shenandoah Valley looked like in the early 1790s. But first, let's introduce the panelists. And I'm just going to arbitrarily start by whoever I see on my Zoom screen here. And that is, we'll start with Rachel Meads. Now, I've known Rachel since I've been here, but interestingly, I knew of Rachel before I arrived. I remember I went to a sort of a folk night in London and met somebody who knew you, who said, when they found out I was coming to Shepherd University, asked if I knew Rachel Meads or Adam Booth. So your reputation preceded you. Rachel, of course, teaches in the Appalachian Studies program here at Shepherd University. Her primary classes focus on the culture of the Appalachian region and on the musicology of the region itself. And Rachel is also in charge of the Appalachian Heritage Festival that we have here at Shepherd University every fall, and has brought some wonderful acts to campus for our students. She's a phenomenal teacher, and she's going to tell us this evening, or fill us in about Appalachian folklore writ large, and hopefully we'll have a conversation going about how we can understand this legend within that larger context. Now, next to Rachel, I see Bill Chappell, who's a member of the Middleway Conservancy, or was until sadly we lost him. He moved to South Carolina of late. But Bill, I've known Bill for the last few years here. He was, while in Jefferson County, was an active member of, as I said, the Middleway Conservancy, but also the Jefferson County Historical Society. His interests focus on the era of the American Civil War. And Bill, over the summer, you, I, and James Grantham were out in the field putting up a sign commemorating the legend of Wizard Clip, and I'll say something more about that in a second. Bill's also a retired lieutenant commander in the U.S. Coast Guard, which explains why he was in the Chesapeake for so long before moving to the Lower Shenandoah Valley. Upon moving to the Valley, he became an active member of the Middleway Conservancy Association and worked with many people to retain the history and character of the village of Smithfield / Middleway. He was served on the board of directors of the Jefferson County Historical Society, and he's become the expert on the legend in Jefferson County, so we're blessed to have him here. And then finally, we have Donna Joy. Donna Joy is a graduate student at Shepherd University, working in the Appalachian Studies program, and she's going to talk to us about her project, a really interesting, exciting new take on the legend of Wizard Clip. So now let's just dive into it from here. Why are we talking about Wizard Clip? Firstly, it's innately interesting, right? But secondly, we're talking about Wizard Clip because of the fact that we've just installed a Legends and Lore sign commemorating the legend on Leetown Road in the middle of Middleway. That, of course, that Legend and Lore sign was brought, we were able to secure that through generous funding from the William G. Pomeroy Foundation, and through the leadership of the West Virginia Folklife Program. And they have been an absolute boon to the state. We've had the director, Emily Hilliard, over to Shepherd on numerous occasions to tell us more about the program. And the Folklife Program were able to bring this Legends and Lore initiative to the state of West Virginia. So Wizard Clip joins other figures like John Henry, the Alderson Lion, and others in this sort of constellation of wonderful monuments that tell the story of the legends and folklore of our state. So let's dive in then to the conversation. And what I would like to do is just take a few minutes before turning it over to Bill to talk about the Lower Valley in the 1790s. Now, the Shenandoah Valley had been had been a home to human habitation for thousands of years preceding the 18th century. But in the 1730s, we begin to see large-scale immigration into the valley. This European migration to the valley actually dates to a bit earlier. We have evidence that the Scots-Irish in particular were here in the 17 teens, but the land was really opened up through the grant system in the 1730s. So we can think of the Lower Valley as a thoroughfare, right? If you follow the contours of the Shenandoah Valley northward up into Pennsylvania, where the mountain arcs towards Philadelphia, becomes a conduit for migrants coming through the valley and into Appalachia via the Great Wagon Road and its burgeoning settlement of Winchester. The reason I mention the fact that this is that the Lower Valley is a conduit of movement is because in order to understand the story we're about to tell, we have to realize that turnpikes and roads are central to our understanding of the landscape of the valley and why people were why we would have had, for instance, a sort of a nameless traveler traveling through Jefferson County in 1794. So the town of Smithfield, what is today Middleway, was established in the 17. Well, there's an establishment earlier, and Bill can fill us in on that to greater detail. But Smithfield becomes this sort of this town on one of the major thoroughfares to Winchester through the valley. This thoroughfare connects Smithfield and Winchester and the town of Shepherdstown on the Potomac River, and connects to the Philadelphia wagon roads from there. So Smithfield is a site that on the road from Winchester to Shepherdstown. It would have been a well-traveled road in the 1790s, which would have given the occasion to frequent travelers stopping off for refuge during overnight on their way up or down the valley. I also want to quickly say, we're going to hear more about the legend in a second, but I want to talk about quickly what we know is true about the legend. And we'll meet Adam Livingston when Bill goes into the story in greater detail. But we know from the deeds of Berkeley and Jefferson counties that at one Adam Livingston did exist, and he did cede land to one Reverend Dennis Cahill in 1803. That would later become the site of Priestfield, and we'll hear about that in a minute. So we have main actors identified in this story. We have textual evidence of their existence and of the transmission of land connected to the story. That's sort of a broad context to sort of introduce us to Smithfield and to the fact that this legend, albeit shrouded in folklore, does seemingly rest on a foundation of fact. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bill, who will tell us about the legend itself and perhaps some of the remediations of the legend as it's developed over time.
You're muted, Bill.
There we go.
So common these days.
So I'll just say that the first I heard about the legend of Wizard Clip, I was not even living in the town. I had come over to meet friends who were introducing me, and that topic was like the first thing. Oh, you got to hear about the legend of Wizard Clip. So it's quite common, and everybody seems to have their own little particular version of the legend of Wizard Clip, inside Clip, as it used to be called. So the story begins, a stranger walks into a tavern. That sounds like a pretty good story to start with. And it all starts with literally with the stranger. But the little bit background is this guy Adam Livingston had come from Pennsylvania just a few years before and had set up his farm there along with his wife and family. The reason a guy would show up at a tavern, in particular in 1794, was because there were no real hostels, there were no real places for somebody to spend the night. Middleway being Middleway pretty much from anywhere, there were one or two taverns in town, but they weren't necessarily places to stay overnight. So the habit was to find somebody who had an extra room or even an extra place by the fire where somebody could stay the night. And that's basically what happened. Livingston was probably there at the tavern having a little ale along with everybody else. And the guy asked, is there somebody where I can stay? And that's what started. So the stranger and Livingston went back to his home and had a good conversation, late into the night. And then Livingston went to bed, and so did the stranger. What happens, though, later on is that Livingston hears a noise, presumably in the living room where the stranger would have been staying, and came out, and the guy is very ill. And he asks for a Catholic priest to give last rites. Livingston is a Lutheran, and he doesn't know any Catholics at that point, being new to the village. He might have known a couple, and we'll talk about them later. But at any rate, there was no Catholic priest to be had. Some people say that the wife was against the whole thing anyway, since he was Catholic and they were strong Lutherans. There were a couple of friends who there in the village, McSherry and Minguinny, who were also were Catholics and were trying to help him out. But at that point, there weren't any Catholics within the county at that point. the guy continued to suffer all night, and finally by morning he was dead. They had a stranger, a stranger's funeral there in the meantime, um, not knowing where he was. And there are questions as to where that actual place is to this day. But once that was done, the strange things began. Logs began to jump and dance, and the fires would actually almost explode, and pieces come flying out. Embers would fly out of the fire and into people's faces, or actually start setting clothes on fire. The next morning, a teamster was coming down the road, and there was a line across, a rope across the road. And he stopped and yelled to Livingston to, put down the rope so he could move his cart along. And Livingston doesn't see it. It says, "Go ahead, there's nothing there." And so we walked through. So it's just sort of disappeared. This kept up for several weeks. And then only further along, the clippings started. And that's where the wizard clip thing comes from in the story. People would find their clothes clipped. They would be in a half moon shape, which I'm told is a shape that you use when you're making a shirt and making a cut under the arm so that the sleeve will hang correctly. But it was everywhere. Even animals seemed to get their heads clipped off. People would come up not believing, and their clothes would be clipped, or they would just hear noises that would frighten them, and they would run away. A tailor made light of it. And when he walked past the house, he also was clipped. So it was a constant worry to the whole family. Poor Livingston didn't know what to do. He talked to several preachers. A Lutheran preacher came by. He could make no headway. In fact, some people said he ran away after being confronted by the spirit. And Livingston was frantic and beside himself. So one night he had a dream. In the dream, he saw a man in a dark robe, like a priest's robe, and he seemed to have the answer. So Livingston starts looking around to find a Catholic priest. Nobody really knows, but he talks to his friends, McSherry and McGinney, to see where he could find a priest. Well, it turns out that a Father Cahill had started up a small chapel in Shepherdstown, and he was there maybe once a month. So what they did was take Livingston to Shepherdstown to meet this guy to see what he can do. Well, when he sees Father Cahill, he realizes this is the man of his dream. And he explained the whole thing to Father Cahill, who, he's probably a little doubtful himself, but he says, "I will try to help you out." So he goes back with Livingston to his home after actually talking with his boss, and I forget where he was, but the priest that was in charge of that particular area, and who said, "Yes, go ahead, try to help this poor man out." So he did, and he did realize that there was something there, and he talked to the spirit, and gave a little relief to the Livingston, but he did come back. So again, he talked with his superior, who said, "You need to do something that's stronger to actually remove the spirit from those premises." Father McCahill did come back. And my understanding from talking with with priests, particularly Catholic priests. They said that you don't do an actual exorcism like you would on a person for a place, but you hold a mass, a Eucharist, basically the same thing you would do in a mass in a church in that building. And that is what is, and basic pray that this spirit will leave. And this is what Father Cahill finally did. And it did remove that, the spirit and the clippings, the strange sounds, the stopping horses on the side of the road. This all disappeared. But it wasn't over for the Livingstons. The Livingstons were now notorious, and people would come by and they'd want to talk about it and on and on and on. And the upshot of the whole thing is that they basically went back to Pennsylvania and there lived out the rest of their lives. But a part of it, particularly with the version that comes out through the Catholic Church, is that Father Cahill continued to keep track of them. And they also were visited by a spirit who helped them understand the Catholic faith. And Adam Livingston in particular became a strong Catholic. And because he was so grateful of Father Cahill and the Catholic Church in helping him, he ended up granting the 34 acres of land, now called Priest Field, to the priest to use as a retirement, or not a retirement, but just a retreat for priests. Most of all, if not all of this, particularly to dealing with the Priest Field, is documented through Catholic Church records. So it's probably, to me at least, one of the most well-documented ghost stories that I've run across. And it still fascinates. And every time I pick up another new version of somebody's discussion of this particular story, I just think, well, it's interesting because everybody seems to have just a tiny little bit of twist, part of their story.
Great.
I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Bill. I think that's a pretty good overview, right? There's several points that, you know, that I would like to sort of kind of explore further. I mean, what's interesting about the story to me is it's, you know, it's often said that the Lower Shenandoah Valley might be kind of an extension of greater Pennsylvania, right? Because of the demographic links with southeastern Pennsylvania owing to geography. Right. So when you think about the main European groups in the valley in the 1790s, we're dealing with a lot of German speakers, of a very diverse German community, actually, including Moravians, Lutherans, as we've seen, and obviously Catholics. We also see that there's a large, though dwindling, Scots-Irish presence in the 1790s in the valley. And that is represented in the story here. But what I find intriguing about this is the degree to which this kind of exposes the world of an under-documented presence of Catholicism in the Lower Valley in the 1790s, right? Coming from my background, looking at the Scots-Irish in particular, there's kind of an assumption that migration is overwhelmingly Presbyterian, but the Catholic element within that migration is often downplayed in discussions. But here we see, you know, Father Cahill. It's clearly a reference to an Irish priest. I believe it's McWhiney, is that right? The confidant in town is clearly an Irish Catholic. So we do see this Catholic presence is brought to life in this story. Beyond the supernatural elements, I think it's a really great sort of social, a snapshot of the social frameworks and confessional frameworks of the Lower Valley in the 1790s. And I wonder if anybody would like to say something about that or to add anything to that. And God, we haven't even talked about Gallitzin, this man. We'll talk about him later. Wow, okay.
Well, before we go there, Ben, if I may real quick, first, thank you everyone who's been tuning in, and a number of you have been commenting with personal stories, which we deeply appreciate.
Yeah.
Some of our colleagues are out there tonight. Jan Hafer, Heidi Hanrahan, we deeply appreciate you all tuning in. For those of you who live in the area, thank you so much. I'm trying to read through the comments as we speak. And so if you have variations of Bill's excellent telling, and some of you are kind of adding to that, please continue to do so in the comments section. We can certainly talk about that. So I just wanted to acknowledge that very quickly. I also wanted to say, for those of you who haven't been to Middleway, if I may very quickly, this area has just so many treasures, which is why those of us who live here, I think, just enjoy it so much. And so I'm gonna just do a quick screen share. And the first image that I wanted to show is the one that Ben, my colleague, had referenced earlier, and that, of course, is the Pomeroy Foundation. This is their webpage for History and for Life. This sign in question is right there below us, and it features a crescent moon, perhaps an allusion to the eclipse that Bill referred to. And then, of course, we have the Middleway Conservancy itself. And again, just featuring this incredible ecosystem of just 18th and 19th century architecture that is just absolutely striking. And so again, if you haven't been to these areas, please do take an opportunity not only to visit the wayside markers that my friends and colleagues helped to create, but also just gain some sense of the rich architectural heritage and history in this area. And so with that quick interlude, I'll turn it back to the floor. And I think what Ben was trying to highlight here is just the tremendous religious and ethnic diversity that had existed in the Lower Valley, and how this story of folklore and I guess a ghost tale, as Bill said, can illuminate all these broader forces. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to my panelists.
That's one of the things that I found really interesting about this particular folktale. I feel like of all the folktales that I have ever really delved into, and there are a lot of them, and I'll hold that until it's my turn to kind of talk about folklore in terms of West Virginia stories and ghost stories of Appalachia, which we have tons of them. But this one is really unique, and I think it's for that reason. Two things about it make it suit, well, there's more than two, but two that really stand out for me are this idea of this clear division of looking for a Catholic priest when you're a Lutheran, and this idea of how religion plays in and the cultural differences of the people who are settling in the region. It's much more pronounced in this story than it is in many of the other stories that you're going to encounter, because the regions either tend to be more homogenous, where they're coming at it, or one group, I don't know, is a little more demonized. And in this way, not to say that at the beginning, this is a conversion story. I mean, 100%, this is a story of a man who goes from absolutely no priest shall cross my door in some tellings of this to a much more like, and now I've gone full circle and I have converted because that was the vision that was sent to me. But that's one of the things that I think is really interesting, is that cultural clashing and how that plays out in this story. And it does tell us a lot about who's settling in this region. So I knew Ben would pick up on that, because he's really into the who's settled where and what's their story, what's their history. And the other thing about this one that is interesting is that grounding in absolute facts that we have so much. I mean, there are deeds of, records that show us these facts, and there is a lot out there that's written about this particular haunting, this poltergeist experience. There's a ton of stories that have been documented about it with all of these great factual grounding pieces, which I think engage us even more, because you start with that piece and it feels like, oh, but this is truer than true.
Yeah, great. When you say it's also a conversion story, and perhaps Bill, we could talk about the different remediations here, but I'm also intrigued about the role that sort of gender plays in all this, because in the stories that I had heard, and I think I'm borrowing from, unfortunately, I don't have the name of the author here, which is horrendous. But a 1904 story that was published by the West Virginia, or iteration that was published by the West Virginia Historical Society. And they comment on the wife. Livingston's wife is the one who's like, we're not having a priest come through our door, so there's this sense where she's the strong woman, and then Adam Livingston's just like, oh, okay, we'll deal with the haunting, right? So I'm wondering if, and perhaps we could talk about gender within the context of the larger context of Appalachian folklore here, but it does strike me, that's the side. And eventually, I think the wife converts too, but she's the sort of the grudging figure in the whole ordeal.
I think he had two daughters, and one converted and stayed converted, and the other sort of wandered away after several years.
Mm-hmm.
But as I recall, the wife was converted once and for all, finally.
Yeah. Great. Well, Rachel, I think this might be a good time to perhaps you could tell us more about Appalachian folklore and ghost tales.
Sure. Well, I think there are folk stories, and there's a tradition of ghost stories, haunt stories, demon stories, scary stories that roots way back culturally, not just here, but everywhere, sort of throughout over the whole planet. And I think it's part of what makes us human is our desire to make meaning, and stories that we don't have an answer to, the things that can't be explained. Those are the things that I think really hook us, that we as creatures, as humans, want to create meaning, and we want to understand and be able to explain things, find a meaning for it. So in folklore, that has meant creation tales. Why does this thing look the way it does? Why does the rose have its thorns? Why, how did the ox get its horns? How did our creators create us in the way that they did? So all of these stories are all part of that human meaning making experience. And I think one of the things that I love about studying these is I think that we're still doing it. I don't think this has ended. I think we are 100%. If you look at the ghost tales that we have recently seen, ghost stories of Shepherdstown, unsolved mysteries, whatever it is that's out there in the current ether, we are still doing this. We are still trying to create meaning and unpack it and solve things that are unsolvable. And I think this one is particularly good and partly juicy because I love this character, and this shows up a lot in particularly Appalachian stories and stories that are part of the oral tradition of this region. The idea of the wandering traveler and the nameless stranger, it's such an archetype. And we see some of those archetypes even coming from the British Isles. We see some of the pull in our stories that come from Jack Tales. You see it there too. But this idea of the wandering traveler who doesn't have a name and we don't know who he is. And sometimes in a lot of stories, he ends up being sinister. He's sort of this figure that can have malice behind him. In this particular story, the family, the Livingstons, they do good works. They're charitable. And so what they choose to do as good Lutherans is open their home and show charity and kindness and open themselves to the stranger to allow him to come in. And I think that that's part of a long sort of tradition that I see in the region. That's a common theme. But then something goes off the rails, and that's the other common theme too, is that there's always something that's just not settled. You have this mystery. And so we're asking ourselves, and I found myself asking this about the Wizard's Clip story. The first time I heard it, I was really fascinated with the nameless traveler. I wanted to know, who was he? Why was he traveling? Where was he going? Who were his family? What was his purpose? Because he dies in the home of this family asking for last rites. they don't fulfill that request, and therefore there are consequences. And Livingston tries to do the right thing. He comes back and calls for someone. He even pays someone to come and sit with him, to be in a wake, basically have a wake. So he has the body of a stranger who he doesn't know who to return him to. He doesn't know anything. And all of these pieces come together. He's trying to do right by him, even though he may feel bad that he couldn't do the last rites piece. Because he said, I don't know anybody who's Catholic. We're a tiny little community. We're sort of isolated from one another. Everybody here is Lutheran. None of the people that I know around me are Catholic. It would be a journey. We would have to go to Shepherdstown, which now seems like not a big deal, but then it might have seemed like a very big deal in the 1700s to search out someone you don't know, and someone who is ethnically different than you, and that you may be afraid to approach because of all the stereotypes and misconceptions that you had about them. So there's a lot of interesting cultural things going on there, and also because we have all of those absolute factual details that anchor this, people's accounts of, well, I went in and I put my hat in my pocket and wrapped it up carefully because I heard that everything was cut up with scissors. And when I came out of the house, it was cut to shreds. Like, it's like magic tricks are happening. You know, crazy things are happening. And some of them are full of malice. But I really find this is a particularly compelling story. I mean, it's such a good ghost story. Ruth Ann Musick, who wrote a great version of this in her book of folk stories. She used to be at Fairmont State University, or Fairmont State College at that time, and has a version of it in her book. There are other versions that other people have sort of kept expounding on this. They keep being retold and retold. But there's a part in Ruth Ann Musick's version. Listen to this, it's just so good. On the night of his death, a man was asked to sit with the corpse. Queer things happened. Lights went out, strange sounds were heard, and the members of the household were thoroughly frightened. In a few days, matters became worse. The sound of horses galloping around the house at night was heard. Livingston's barn was burnt, and his cattle died. Dishes were thrown upon the floor and broken with no visible agency, in quotes. Money disappeared. The heads of chickens and turkeys dropped off. Burning chunks of wood leaped from the fireplace, endangering the house. Soon the annoyances which were destroying Adam Livingston's peace assumed a new form. The sound of shears was heard in his house, clipping in Half Moon and other curious figures, his blankets, sheets, and counterpanes, his boots, saddle, and clothing. This continued for 3 months. I love this because it's calling upon all of this great imagery, and it's not just the way she's writing it, it's the story. These stories tapping into all of the things that good stories do, all of our, like, the sounds, the sight, the smell, all of our senses are kind of drug into this. And we have this unknown that we can't explain, and all of this sort of hostile behavior that's happening. And I just find it to be a particularly great Appalachian folktale. Like, this is a good ghost story, y'all. And it has a resolution, that it has an ending. A lot of the folk tales that you find that might be sort of similar to this, there are a lot of them that are rooted in fact. Like in my hometown, where I grew up in Glenville, West Virginia, there's a legend of Sis Lynn. And the story of Sis Lynn is based on her murder, a brutal murder that happened, where she is, you know, people broke in the house and they murder her and decapitate her, and people see, you know, Sis Lynn's ghost walking at certain times of the night. And I grew up looking for Sis Lynn in the woods, you know, like my friends, we would go looking, you know, try to find her. I think a lot of those true tales of things that were troubling and disturbing that we couldn't understand take on a life of their own. And these historic events like that really have a real documented, like I can pull up the news article on Sis Lynn the same way we can pull up the factual background on this particular story. It bolsters it, and it makes it helps us try to process it and make meaning of it. But that's kind of my take on it. But this one's a particularly good story.
Yeah, that's great. And one point you talked about the archetype of the traveler. I'm looking at Doug Perks's notes, and Doug Perks is the curator of the Jefferson County Museum of History. And there's this point in his notes where he's frustrated that we don't know the name of the stranger. And he says, where's the name? So there's that, coming from a historian's point of view, there's this tension. You want to know, but then obviously in the way that the legend's constructed, you're kind of not meant to, right? So that blending of sort of fact and fiction, I think is absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
And it gets bolstered more for those of you. Here's a pitch to go to Middleway. If you've never been there, and you can go there and explore all of this, because it's a really cool, historic little town, absolutely, or hamlet, as the case may be. But there's also, if you go to Priestfield, that monument that's to the unknown traveler, it's compelling. Like, you sit there and look at it and you're like, wow, here he is. He really is here. And I want to know, who is he? And what is his name? Absolutely. What's his story? That's what we're trying to figure out, I think.
Yeah.
There's go ahead. There's an alternative story that would say that it wasn't the guy that died, but that a guy had been killed there and was sanctified when he was buried. And he kept coming back until Mangini particularly actually brought him back, and buried him properly and said the rites over him so that he would continue or quit going on with the haunting. So that's another alternative ending, you might say.
Yeah, there's one version that I read that has him, originally Livingston is like, just do whatever exorcism thing you can do, just do that once and go. And so he does it, and there's peace for a while. And then there's another version where it lasts for just a few months and then it wears off. So the exorcism kind of wears off. So then he has the dream and he realizes he needs to go back and have the priest come back and say a full mass in the house. And then he starts having these feelings of maybe I have a message, because then it stops. And then he has these visions that he needs to maybe convert, that this is a message to him. So it's kind of interesting watching like the different tellings of it, how that plays out.
Can I beseech those on Facebook to please record your message? If anybody has any stories about decapitations, that's I'm interested. Which sounds really horrible. But one of the lines that comes up, and I think the 1850 account, is ducks crossing the road and then stopping to see and it describes them having been cleanly decapitated by an unseen shear, right? So so if anybody has any sort of local takes on this, or what you grew up with, please do send them into the chat. Maybe we can discuss them afterwards. At this point, I want to introduce another panelist here, Donna Joy, who's a graduate student in the Appalachian Studies Department here at Shepherd University. And Donna, you're doing some wonderful work on this legend as part of your curriculum, working with Dr. Sylvia Sherbet. Could you tell us more about your work?
Okay, and I apologize, but I keep losing internet, so there'll be pauses. So I'm going to start by looking at life during the time of, and Middleway was Virginia at that time. Mm-hmm. And there was, in the culture, the idea of witches and witchcraft was there was a antique map that hung in Stone Soup years ago before it closed. And I was always trying to understand or try to get a better definition of what it means laying of witch. The area of Smithfield there's a location, which is now Priestfield, that they said on this map, and it was the county map, and they described it as a place for laying of witches. I've looked a lot to see what that means, but I haven't really found a good meaning for that back in the 1700s. And then moving on from the foundation, culture would have been like, then I would talk about in my thesis, the story and the many versions. And I have over 100 different versions of the story. I went to Charleston and copied every couple of years, another newspaper puts out a version, and lots of books, their version. But I really wanted to get into some of the things that aren't the public and community aren't really familiar with. And so, for example, later that property was held for, I think, over 100 years. It was a battle between the Catholic Church and the descendants of the people that had the trust. And in, I think, 1921, the same judge that tried Bill Blue on giving the land to the Catholic Church in the end. I thought that was interesting. Galdessin, Russia, he was a prince and went to Baltimore. John Carroll, he was the head of the Catholic Church in the area at that time. And Galdessin got his orders, became a priest, and he was the apostle of the Alleghenies. So he traveled around Alleghenies, and I don't know if they call it preaching. We haven't talked a lot about him tonight, but he documented a lot of the things that happened, and that's how the Catholic history. He, was a witness to the exorcism that occurred by Cahill. They were together. That's a long story. We don't have a lot of time. So, and he's now up for sainthood by the Catholic Church, and he. So they're collecting stories about miracles that he performed. So, and then the other thing that I think most people might not be aware of is there's a whole nother story of the bishop, Pope Pius VI was, he was arrested. And before that happened, he sent orders to Carroll in Baltimore to infiltrate the colony of Virginia because Catholics couldn't own property. The church couldn't own property. And supposedly, according to one book, they targeted Livingston. I know people don't want to hear, but this is just, another version. So they claimed that it was a way for the church to get property. Another fits in part of the folklore or the tradition, rather. This property, supposedly Livingston got the property because the owner, the original owner, had been murdered. And so it was supposedly sold illegally. And I don't know if that's true, something I have to look up. Andrew Hampton was the original owner. So there was this custom that you could, this property was haunted because it was gotten fraudulently, the person had been killed, and maybe he was haunting it. And Livingston was told he could either, they could perform an exorcism, or they could just give the church the land, and that would settle the debt. So I know these are, putting a damper on the whole romantic story of Middleway. Anyway, so those are some of the things that I want to look more into and bring out. So I guess that's about it.
Great. Well, thank you, Donna. And yeah, we do have records going back to the Gooch Grant, I believe in 1732 or 34, for that land going to, and again, this is coming from the from notes sent to us by Doug Perks to John and Reese Smith. But there is a point where we we have the filings of the land to Cahill in 1803, but you're right. There's a lot of ambiguity in between. So
let me, if I may, Ben. I'm sorry. Thank you, Donna. That was absolutely wonderful. Sort of, I think, further context that we deeply appreciate, and glad that we're sort of able to engage our graduate students and what this kind of continuing education. I want to make a quick reference here that was brought up in the comments. There's been a lot of really fabulous comments, people sort of augmenting their versions of the story that I deeply appreciate. But because we are the Civil War Center, John Eric Gillett makes a really important point that I sort of forgot about. And for those of you who aren't aware, James Taylor, later, of course, a famous musician, but in the Civil War era, is a sketch artist. And James Taylor comes through the Lower Valley, and Taylor is commissioned to work in Middleway for a time. And so John Eric writes this wonderful piece in the Emerging Civil War. I'm just going to scroll through it very quickly here, but you can see how he does a really nice matchup between some of the contemporaneous sketches and then what these places look like today. And so he visited some of the very sites that we've been talking about. And eventually the entirety of his the body of his work is published in a really good book that was put out, I think, in the late 80s. That's the James Taylor sketchbook. But again, for those of you who haven't seen John Eric's wonderful article or James Taylor sketches, please do so. And I know we're running close to our time here, but one of our colleagues and friends asked, and this is what sort of intrigued me, and I admittedly know very little about this, and Bill sort of said a little bit about the clip, but I mean, why this crescent moon? And we see that, of course, that image of fertility, that image of life and death, it circulates a lot through folklore, but this seems to me like to be extraordinarily unusual. Like, there's a lot of elements of the story that resonate, that seem very familiar to me. My wife studied folklore as an undergraduate. I've peeked into some of her books, so a lot of it resonates. But then this one particular image and these clippings, do any of you know of any other instances in folklore or mythology where we see something similar to this, or is this a local phenomenon? And if so, do we know why? I mean, that seems to be a pretty big question to me. And then again, to Keith Alexander.
I would defer on this one to Bill if he has a better take on it, but I have never seen anything that's quite as captivating as that. Those images, particularly imagining, bed sheets and things being pulled up and having moons all over them, like, that's great stuff. That's scary and spooky and cool, but that is such a Celtic fertility symbol that I felt like, that's how I read that too when I saw it. And I don't know if that's factual, because I didn't know about the scissors that were meant to be curved like that, because I am not a person who's ever made men's clothing of the period. So I think that's an interesting take, because maybe that is more normal if that's how your scissors were shaped to cut that way. But it sounded very unusual in the accounts, the historic accounts of people, because this really drew people. This became a tourist attractor. People came to see what was going on in Middleway. They were like, what's happening in Smith?
So this actually predates me by a couple of decades. There's a map, which I have a copy of, and you can get it from the Jefferson County Historical Society. And it shows the picture of the wizard, which we used to have on our, maybe still do, on the pictures of the conservancies put up around Middleway. And it also has the pair of the shears, the big old shears. And it talked about, the crescents. The crescents is evidently when you fold over the cloth and you use your shears to cut that half moon or that sliver of a moon in order to, and then sew those together. So you've got a cut underneath to hold your, to fold over the sleeve. But I don't know how or why that would work, because I'm not in any way a seamstress.
Has that, from what I recall of some of the remediations, later remediations, the assumption was then that the stranger was a tailor. Is that where that comes from? The fact that this is a very particular, this is a tailor cut, there, ergo, that must have been the stranger's occupation. Is that right?
That's as much as I've seen in the different versions. But the original, the Catholic version of it doesn't say one way or the other.
I saw in doing some research about this that even at one point, kind of getting back to Donna's research, which is really interesting, looking at what historically might have been going on that we're unaware of or that we haven't explored deeper. Because before the stranger appears, there are some accounts that Livingston's having some issues with livestock and crops before this happens, that things are not going as well for him here as they were in Lancaster County. So I think that as this develops and as you see this happen, the story of the exorcism happening with Father Gallatin, who we've now started to explore a little bit, who definitely, this means that the story of Wizard's Clip and Middleway has now been seen somewhere in the Vatican. Like somebody at the Vatican knows this is going on because somebody's done this research looking into Gallatin. But there is a question about it because at one point, some of the heirs, the Livingston heirs, wanted to challenge the giveaway of the land to the Catholic Church. They wanted to reclaim, and they went to court to try and reclaim some of that land. And when they did, they lost. They didn't get it back. But that part of what happens at Priestfield now every year, and I think it's in June, they hold a mass at Priestfield in the tiny little chapel that's held annually. And am I right about that, Bill? That it is, and I think it's part of it. There's a theory that also helps to kind of keep that tie to like the obligations of the land, or you must do this because it's keeping all the spirits calm, is the thought. Oh, you're muted, Bill.
No, I'm not familiar with that particular thing on the Elm Priestfield.
Great. Well, and that's the contested ownership of the land, I think, ties in really well with what Donna was saying here about the sort of ambiguity of this of the transfer. If time permitting, I was just wondering if anybody has any thoughts about the legacy of Wizard Clip and it's how it's sort of resonates in the county today.
If I may, Ben, let me take that bit. So we are about at an hour, and so what I've done is and I promise I'll get to that. I've posted in the comments section a couple of resources, including the walking tour provided by the Middleway Conservancy, the Pomeroy Foundation's webpage, as well as John Eric's piece on Taylor's sketches. And so I'm going to give you all a time limit here. So maybe in 1 minute or less, can each of you sort of offer sort of a final concluding thought about the legacy of Wizard Clip? And you could do it a little bit more than a minute here, but I think let's have some final sort of concluding thoughts about the continued meaning, legacy, and impact of this important folktale, both to sort of the Middleway area, but maybe if you want to expand upon that idea more broadly about Appalachia. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over first to Rachel, and then we'll bounce among our group.
Well, how much more impactful can you have when you've got a story that begins as a man walks into a bar story? I mean, as Bill described it, you know, we got a great beginning, you got this great mystery, you got all these facts, and then you have all of these unresolved things. And I think that for the people who I know who live in Middleway, it's a real point of pride because it still does bring people there. People still do come searching for this folklore and this history and trying to, I think, solve the mystery and see it for themselves, which is exactly what was happening in 1790s when people were trying to see it for themselves then too, and be like, what's really going on? And the unbelievers coming searching for, is this real or not, and leaving believers. I think that still has an impact on us. And I think it very much is a part of the legacy and the heritage of the people. And I saw a few people commenting on Facebook and the feed that are from that area who are really fondly like, this is your story. And it's part of your growing up, your childhood, your memories of, like, you know, like me with Sis Lynn, looking for that historic mystery figure that looms large in our cultural identity. So I think that's how I look at it.
Okay, thank you. Donna, do you want to offer some concluding sentiments?
Okay. Father Gallazin, then that's pretty relevant. And the Ghost of Shepherdstown, they did an episode on Middleway. This story, and every couple of years there's another version of the story. Life. Personally, for me, I am drawn to it and appreciate it. My ancestors on one side were Mennonites and Amish, and they went to Lancaster and from Switzerland and Germany, and they brought with them a book called the Sixth and Seventh Books of Moses. And these were spells that were used to do things. And these folk stories that you read about in Ruth Ann music, I think it might be in some of her stories, but there are lots of these stories, Appalachian stories of with the heads, the milk coming bloody, things like that. And these this book and these prayers were used to remove these certain disorders or hauntings. And the stopped kind of believing in miracles and believing in the use of the Bible to cast out demons, but the Catholic Church continued. And so anyway, I'm going around. It's just fascinating, the different religions and how some of these traditions continue, and the ties that they have to some of the original settlers, and personally the Amish that came through. That makes sense.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And Bill, I know you've gone farther south, but your heart probably still lies in West Virginia, and so you've probably been the most invested in this. So again, maybe if it's okay with Ben, can we give Bill the last words here? Okay. So with that, then I'll turn it over to Bill.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I did spend almost 18 years in Middleway, and like I said, that was the first story I heard of the place. And I talked to many people who've lived there, and many people who've lived there for generations. And that is part and parcel Middleway. I think they'll have to burn the place to the ground before it'll go away from the people. And it won't go away then, because everybody who's been there, it's now part of them.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much for those sentiments. And so with that, Ben, do you want anything else in concluding?
No, I think that's about it. Thank you all for taking the time out to talk to us about this story. This has been a wonderful conversation for me, and I've greatly appreciated it.
Okay. Well, thank you to you all for tuning in. I know time is incredibly scarce, and so we deeply appreciate your participation this evening. Again, the center itself owes a debt of gratitude to West Virginia Humanities and their support. This particular sign that Ben references is an effort that entails a lot of individuals, of course, but the Pomeroy Foundation in particular is integral to that. And so, again, we sort of appreciate this larger institutional support that has enabled both programming and then, of course, the actual signage. Our panelists, thank you. I came into this with very little knowledge. I tried to do a little bit of, a crash course, but I didn't do too well. So I learned a great deal. So thank you all very much. And with that, we'll go ahead and conclude our program for the evening. So thank you all very much for tuning in. Continue to follow the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War on social media. Our next live stream program will be in early December, and we're going to go back even farther back in time, and we're going to be dealing with the role of African Americans during the American Revolution, but looking at through the lenses of both history and then eventually memory. And we'll have a number of different public historians guiding that discussion. So thank you all, and stay safe, stay healthy, and stay well. So thank you very much.